This is the Walter Bosley Channel podcast. Be sure to visit walterbosley.com for my books and other podcast episodes. You can also sign up for live readings on every second and fourth Tuesdays for Walter Bosley Reads Books. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and be sure to click on the bell for notifications on new episodes and special events. Enjoy the show. So, yes, here we are back at the Walter Bosley channel, and our guest is Ken Swartz. Hello, Ken. How are you?
Doing great. How about you?
Good. It's the video, the film from Ground Zero was real interesting. And that was, of course, the Genie missile test, correct?
Yeah, he thought it would be safer to be in the airplane flying wingman than fool on the ground under Ground Zero.
He did some work with NASA and on the
Yeah,
Apollo program.
yeah. What it is he got called in. He'd done like the Thor missile program. He was their expert on the Thor missile.
Okay.
And then like when Bluegill Prime had a problem, they sent him in there. And then also he went into the Genie program because it was getting sabotaged.
Mm-hmm.
That's another story. And so he completed the Genie missile program. And so they sent him in because what was happening is the stage one of the Apollo was not giving enough thrust. The engines weren't giving enough thrust to get us to the moon. And so he was sent down there to help Werner von Braun and his 11 other Germans to help them figure out what the problem was. And so he'd be sitting, he went there with Werner von Braun and he was looking at the model with Werner and he said, that just looks like a bunch of V2s wrapped together. And Werner von Braun said, that is exactly what it is. But, so they were needing more thrust and he was there for about 6 months. And I can't say that he actually solved the problem. What happened one day, they've been doing test after test after test, trying to get up the power. And one day, one of the fuel pumps broke, the drive shaft broke. So it was just spinning free in the casing while the thing was running, and they got 7% more thrust. And so all they did is they just cut out the fuel pump and put in a straight pipe, and we went to the moon. So
Okay.
It's not heroic, but certainly that's kind of one of those things that happens that allowed us to get there.
Yeah, it's what's funny about that the Apollo landing deniers. They look at they go see the the lunar module in the Air and Space Museum, and they take pictures and they go, "This thing's too flimsy to have been able to land on them," and it's just an ignorance of the technology and how these things worked, and they just can't believe that such an accomplishment was done because to them the technology is too primitive. And I think there's kind of an irony that on the road to the technology we have today, we it becomes something that the generation that's a beneficiary of that doubts, and yet there it is.
I mean, the Japanese went to the moon and they brought, a close orbit. You can't see even with the Hubble Space Telescope on Earth orbit, if you looked for the rovers on the moon or the landing sites, you couldn't see them. They're smaller than a pixel. So, but the Japanese sent a space probe there and took, some high intensity photos of the moon, and then you could see the landing sites. You can see, the tire tracks left over from the rovers. I mean, the Chinese did it, the Russians did it, and so they did land on the moon.
Did your dad ever have any comments about the alleged artifacts or the suspected signs of structures and things on the moon?
No, he never told me anything about that. I don't think he even knew. I mean, he was he had a different place in it. But I knew Jose Escamilla. I don't know if you ever
Oh,
remember him.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and he had like the moon rising, which was amusing because it was the Clementine mission photos.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did is they airbrushed all this stuff out. But instead of blending it, they just airbrushed it. Like if it was a cylinder, they just airbrushed the cylinder out. If it was a dome, so you could still see them. Like it was ridiculous. It was just a ridiculous job. And he made a film about that, and it's kind of amusing. You can see all kinds of things that were strangely airbrushed out.
Oh, that's funny. It's almost as if wink, wink. Let's do this like so ridiculous so that they'll know. Anybody looking at. Do you know John Brandenburg?
No, I don't.
John Brandenburg is a gentleman who he worked on the Clementine, some aspect of Clementine, and he's also the guy who has proposed his theory that an isotope that's present on Mars uh,
Oh yes,
is
Xenon 129.
yeah, and it's evidence of a an artificially induced thermonuclear explosion. Is am I getting that
Well, they
right?
could either be induced by a thermonuclear explosion or atomic reactors.
Oh
They're,
yes,
that's a gas that comes out of both through that process. So take your pick.
I understand that it's a controversial notion. Where do you stand on that?
Oh no, it's definitely that's where it came from.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where you get xenon 129. You know, it's not naturally produced. It's usually you have to have an atomic explosion or a nuclear reactor. So it's kind of like and who knows when the xenon's really heavy gas.
Okay.
So it probably is just going to hang, or it probably can't escape Mars gravity. So you just don't know when it was put into the atmosphere. But yeah, it's definitely signs that there was something like that going on in Mars.
It's very possible that we, the United States, has at least attempted to put boots on the ground on Mars, or whether a close flyby or something. What do you think of that? Do you think
Oh
that's
no, I think
possible?
they've landed, and there's even some evidence they got a small base. You can actually look at some of the pictures.
Yeah.
They had a hard problem. You know, they kind of flushed the sewage out the door, so it leaves a mark on the surface. So yeah, they have yeah. It looks like they've been there. I mean, we have alien reproduction vehicles, anti gravity craft, whatever. You can fly to Mars in just a few days
Yeah.
and come back, and they've done the whole tour of the solar system and everything like that. I mean, the whole rocket stuff with SpaceX and Blue Origin, it's just an illusion, for bread and circuses for the masses. They don't need those to get things into space.
Well, yeah, I personally think that yeah, we landed there, put boots on the ground there, put people there a long time ago, several years
Yeah.
back. And I think that when NASA releases these images from the rover and such that people look at and say, that looks like some type of artifact or object or something. I think that's because that's exactly what it is. And I think the game they're playing is that when they don't comment on this, it's so that down the road they can say, well, we never denied it. We showed you, we released all the photos. You're right. There's artifacts of a destroyed, civilization, structure, object, or whatever. We never denied it, but then they're not confirming it yet right now. And it's kind of I would call it a slow disclosure about Mars.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things people don't know is that lunar dust is extremely toxic. What you're looking at is really ceramic metal shards, extremely sharp, and they'll just destroy your lungs. Like they did the Apollo 17, they did I think two excursions out onto the surface, right? And they were
Mm-hmm.
thinking, oh, let's do a third one. And but they decided, for whatever reasons, that they didn't do a third one. And when they got back and they looked at the the space suits, the abrasion in the joints was so bad that if they had gone out on a third one, it might have leaked out.
Whoa. Now you're saying metal shards. What?
Yeah, it's ceramic metal shards. That's when those meteorites hit that breccia,
Yeah.
covers the surface, and it is just, and it's extremely, it's like ultra silicosis. It's just like imagine just the sharpest glass shards. It's like ceramic metallic glass shards covering the entire surface of the moon. And so it wouldn't be, it's going to be a really difficult environment to go to. I mean, some ways like Mars. See, Mars is more like dust here on Earth. You had
Right.
water, you have wind, and so yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's dusty and nasty, kind of like going to Burning Man or something. It gets everywhere, but it wouldn't be fatal. Whereas
Okay.
kind of the dust on the moon would be rather fatal to people.
Yeah, I've been in areas of Saudi Arabia that you look out a certain vista, and to me, Mars looks a lot
Yeah.
like that. Now some people would say, well, that's because we don't really have landers on Mars. They're faking it. I'm like, don't be ridiculous. There's going to be the same kind of terrains all throughout, the galaxy, the universe, or whatever. On this glass shard issue on the moon, what do you think of Richard Hoagland's long running idea that there were glass dome structures built by a civilization and there's remnants of that?
Oh yeah, there's definitely junk on the moon left over. I don't think
Mhm.
any of it. Well, some might be active, some might not be. Some of the remote viewers saw stuff, but uh, but yeah, I mean, they probably have a little bit better technology to deal with that issue rather than us. I mean, if you got underneath the moon's surface,
Mm,
you were underneath the moon's surface above the brecciated zone, then you could probably it would just be like rock, right?
okay.
And so they saw some. They found that a granite mass on the moon. I don't know if
Hmm.
you ever the Future Forecasting Group. And they did a remote viewing. It's basically if you had one grammatic mass, it's hotter in that area than the moon, the rest of it. And the remote viewers saw like because that's where you would find any water,
Right.
any gases would vent off that one granite pluton. And so they
Okay.
saw something that might have been there at one time. That would be the only place you'd probably want to set up shop if you had to. You could mine the water and the other stuff off that pluton.
Yeah, I've always been intrigued with, they at some point in the 60s, it was before we landed, they reported openly about the moon being hollow, and then they shut up about that. We never heard another word. Has there ever been any official word on that again?
Well, the thing is that the moon rings when it
Mhm.
hits by meteorites,
Yeah.
and that's because it's very cold. I mean, yeah, I
Okay.
mean there is definitely. I mean, somebody lives. What was that? Somebody lives on the moon, or somebody else is on the
There,
moon. There
yeah,
was
there's someone else on the
that
moon.
book. Yeah, there's someone else on the moon. That book. I actually have that book,
Yeah.
and he had gotten some of the unedited photos, and it's definitely stuff there. I mean, tubes and domes and other things that especially in certain craters, that yeah, there's definitely whether it's active now or not, you don't know. It's been sitting up there for 4 billion years.
Well,
So
I think it lends credence to the idea that the moon was parked there. We've read the same material in research on this, that the moon, that's not exactly a natural orbit, if I'm if I'm
well, it's
describing that right.
it's been there for a long time because
Sure.
the Earth used to rotate 10 hours a day.
Hmm.
So it's the moon was much closer, and you can actually go back. They found geologic deposits where you can actually because there's a day annual and then yearly deposits in
Hmm.
history, and they can go back and they can actually tell the time. I think the back in the age of the dinosaurs, the Earth rotated 20-hour days, and now
Mm.
we're down to 24-hour days. And as the Earth's rotation slows down, it transfers that energy is transferred to the moon, so the moon's orbit slowly gets farther and farther away.
Okay.
So,
What
I
do
mean,
you?
when the moon was early moon, you had like 300-foot tides in certain areas of the Earth every day.
Holy smokes. Well,
Yeah.
what do you think about the idea that the moon was some type of generational planetoid type craft that was flown here and placed in orbit?
Yeah, well, we can see over geologic history the actual slowdown of the Earth's rotation
Hmm.
and the reduction in the tides and stuff.
Hmm.
So it's really, yeah, it's been here. If it's somebody flew it here, they flew it here 4 billion years ago.
Right. Right.
So it's just been sitting there. And I mean, it's got a granite pluton in it. It's not hollow. It's not
Okay.
really much of a useless. It's pretty much a useless body as far as there
Okay.
really are a lot of minerals there, and the amount of ice on the South Pole is or what they call the South Pole is pretty
Okay.
minimal. And
It,
so I don't.
it still could have, our civilization, we said we're going to go there. So past civilizations that have come and gone, with their
Or any
various technology
extraterrestrial visitors. I mean,
or
if you're going to
them.
set up a base to study the Earth, you don't. I mean, look, there's a in
Yeah.
one liter of seawater, there's 100 million viruses, you
Hmm.
know, billion bacteria. I mean, you're not going to be wanting to hang out on the Earth.
A good
You're
point.
going to, you probably that would be a perfect place to set up a base
Yeah,
if you want to look at the Earth.
you can better control your own environment,
Yes.
and just like now with all these different countries now having a presence there, many extraterrestrial visitors could have been there, even in some cases at the same time, and certainly over the course of 4 billion years. Imagine
Yes.
who has come and gone and what has come and gone, on and into the moon. And it's in our mythologies and lore, the people from the moon. I'm a great believer in the nugget of truth idea that there's something to these. If the face value of the lore is not
Yeah.
accurate, there's something there. There's some reason that people, came
Well,
up with these ideas.
yeah, the lore of flying saucers, especially in the northern portions of the planet, a large part of them, they come down over the surface of bodies of water and suck in like large amounts of water.
Mhm.
So, if you were on the moon, you don't have water, so you need to get your come out and fill up on water every now and then and go back to the moon. I mean, it's just the way it goes.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And I got to wonder, before we sent something up there to orbit, how many of them obviously would have been on the dark side. And in fact, is there signs of more? I can't remember this part. Is there evidence of more relics or what have you on the dark side than
Yeah, there
on the
does
side
seem
of
to be,
the?
yeah, the stuff that may be more active is on the dark side.
Okay.
And
Okay.
because yeah, so it's yeah, there's definitely that's been noted, but they're not going to let us see that because what it is the way NASA set it up, even from the very beginning.
Hmm.
All of the every photograph and everything, the imaging that comes in from the moon would go to a private company,
Yes.
and then the private company would do whatever they do with it, and then it would go to NASA. Because if a government organization were to like censor things, that would be an unlawful act.
Sure.
But if a private corporation does it, well, and you can't really do a FOIA on a private corporation. So,
Right.
they kind of set that up from the very beginning.
As far as all the folks that are going there now, is the stuff, are they just in an agreement to channel this stuff, through a particular channel? Are they in some type of agreement that they won't spill the beans on what they see up there, or is the stuff gone or covered up? How would they handle that, I
Well,
wonder?
I think they just have, there's probably some unwritten agreement because the Chinese are there, the Russians are there, the Japanese are there,
Yeah.
I guess
India.
the Indians are there. And so there's probably they just, I'm sure they have some of the data, but I mean, so a lot of that stuff, just old ruins that, nobody's going to cover it up because it's just sitting in the bottom of a crater. Anybody can take a picture of it.
Yeah, and I'm guessing in those treaties deals are made where, hey, don't disclose this and it'll be good for you in other ways.
Yeah.
I imagine,
Or it's
but
just, they have some sort of, well, as governments and agencies, they probably have, similar, even if they may be different governments have similar, goals and purposes. So it would just be a natural fit there.
I have recently, I tend to think that, because you got to ask yourself, why would the Russians, why would the Chinese cooperate with us on, not disclosing what's on the moon? Why would all these countries agree to that? And I'm thinking, well, to me, the obvious answer might be that it's the ETs themselves that say, you will not disclose any past presence, you will not disclose our current presence. I think ET himself controls the disclosure.
Yeah. Well, it's like Jose Escamilla on originally the moon rising film. He had contracted with some guy who had a 22-inch telescope,
Mm-hmm.
and this guy had just dozens of giant craft flying between the Earth and the moon. First, on the Mars story,
Mm-hmm.
if we get up there, there's there's the Mars Climate Orbiter.
Uh-huh.
This is kind of the NASA blunders thing I talk about. And the Mars Climate Orbiter was going to basically have a polar orbit over Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, one of the things, if you want to get a spacecraft in orbit, you got to slow it down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with the moon or something without an atmosphere, you just have to retro rocket in.
Yeah.
But with Mars, there's an atmosphere, and they have a thing called aerobraking,
Right.
where they just barely touch the top of Martian atmosphere, and that slows it down because that saves you all the fuel you'd have to haul from Earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is very expensive and stuff. So they would do that, and so they were going to do the Mars Climate Orbiter, and this was one of those classic, blunders. What happened? It was the craft had been built by Lockheed Martin.
Mm-hmm.
And Lockheed Martin was always going through various mergers, acquisitions, purges. It's a corporation, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they're squeezing for the profit line. So it had just gone through a thing where most of the mid-level guys had got fired or let go, and they replaced them with a bunch of wet behind the ears kids out of college, and then the really old guys that
Mm-hmm.
like were running departments, and they're just hanging on for as long as they can to maximize their retirement. And so the guys that actually had done a lot of the work on the Mars Climate Orbiter, right, they were gone now, and they
Mm-hmm.
had to rely on like the old guy that's the department chair that's hanging out there. So what it was is that Mars Polar Orbiter Climate Orbiter was getting close to getting to insertion. And so the guy from JPL, a young guy from JPL, called up, and what it is there was a transition probably in the 60s and 70s
Hmm.
toward there, where we used to be under the old English system,
Okay.
and the unit of thrust was a thing called foot-pounds, and that's the amount of energy it's just like it sounds, to move 1 pound 1 foot high, right? Well, everybody in the new thing is under the metric system, and they use newtons, and a
Right.
newton is how much it takes to lift 1 kilogram 1 meter. I believe that's
Okay.
what a newton is. And so what happened is all the old guys had been doing it in foot pounds. So the guy from JPL, who doesn't know anything about foot pounds, he'd never ever heard of them, he doesn't understand it, calls up the guy at Lockheed Martin, and the Lockheed Martin guy gives him the how much energy he needs to catch orbit in foot pounds. And then the guy at JPL just imagines it's newtons, and of course he punches that number in, and they don't know whether the Mars Polar Orbiter burned up in the atmosphere,
Mm.
or it bounced off the atmosphere, is now tumbling through space. But a newton is much bigger than a foot pound, so that was the end of the Mars Climate Orbiter.
Yeah. Well, you've done some work. You sent me a link to a couple of papers. The one paper, and I have to admit, um, well, when it got into some technical details, it's Greek to me, but the concept was really interesting. How is tell us about your work, with the this particular
Oh, the
topic.
new gravitational formulations, I believe.
Yes, exactly.
Probably talking
Yeah.
about, yeah. Well, basically, I was doing my master's thesis on the
Hmm.
retention of magnetic fields in rotating terrestrial planets through the actions of a close large orbital partner.
Uh-huh.
That's why the moon why the Earth still has a magnetic field. But anyway,
Okay.
when I was doing that, I found that the Newton's mathematics was not, because I wanted to do stuff about the surface of the Earth, above,
Hmm.
inside, all kinds of whistles and bells. And basically, what Newton did, which was great in the age of sailing ships, he took the whole volume of the Earth or the moon or any other body, and you theoretically shrink it down to an infinitesimal point, right? All the mass and volume, and then you shrink the moon down to an infinitesimal point, and
Hmm.
then you can actually make a calculation to get gravitational attraction between them,
Okay.
which is a great thing. But the problem is the Earth spins, and so it kind of bulges out in the middle,
Right.
and it's shorter between the
Right.
poles than it is across the equator because it
Hmm.
bulges out. And so if you try, and with Newton's mass thing, it has an infinitesimal point at the center, and
Hmm.
it spreads out with a perfectly spherical gravitational field.
Okay.
And since the Earth is not perfectly spherical, as an oblate spheroid, when you try to use Newton's formulation to calculate gravity on the surface of the Earth, it fails.
Right. Okay.
So what I did is I basically I kind of took it. You can actually derive Newton's formulations from my formulation. Instead of having an infinitesimal point, I turned it into an infinitesimal line segment that goes between whatever the poles of the Earth, the equator, wherever you want to measure. So I
Okay.
created infinitesimal, and using that, I can make 3 magnitudes more accurate estimating gravity on the surface of the Earth or somewhere in orbit or whatever it is. The little bit of difference, which is all important if you're landing a spacecraft or stuff. If you have a sailing ship or something, it doesn't matter.
Right.
But with spacecraft, it does matter. And so I developed it. Of course, when I showed it to my master's thesis guy, he said, your theory is radical enough without introducing a bunch of new gravitational mathematics. So after that was done in 1999, that was quite a while ago,
Uh-huh.
25 years ago or more.
Okay.
And yeah, I eventually, I fully developed them and put them out there. There's a whole story on that. And part of it, well, I'll talk more about that when we get about landing on the moon.
Okay.
But part of this is because what I did is the Mars polar, there's a thing called the Mars polar lander.
Hmm.
And as you imagine, it's going to land near Mars pole, to learn about what's going on there. And it crashed. And so I went looking why it did this. And I was looking at it, and I've discovered, I think it's been scraped now,
Hmm.
but they were estimating Mars, the oblateness of the Earth is 0.03%, right?
Hmm.
0.03. The oblateness of Mars is 0.05. It's actually more oblate, more kind of bulging out in the middle than even the Earth. And from what I could tell, they estimated Mars gravity, Mars polar gravity, as as less than it was actually doing, because they were using the perfect Newtonian sphericals.
Okay.
and where they were going to land. So they were estimating that the gravity was stronger, I believe, than what they thought it would be, right? So what it is when they basically they came in, the Mars have a heat shield, right? The Mars polar lander has a big heat shield. It comes into the Mars atmosphere, it slows way the hell down with
Hmm.
the heat shield. And when it slows to a certain down, some parachutes pop out,
Okay.
and that pulls the lander off the heat shield, which flies to the surface, and then the parachutes slow it down. And then the last 4 kilometer burn, it was going to the parachutes drop off and the retro rockets kick in,
Uh-huh.
and they fire their way to the Mars surface, right, slowing the craft down. And what happened is if you estimate Mars gravity is higher than it actually is at that thing, and at the last like 10 meters, the landing radar, altimeter radar with stuff would kick in and then guide it down the last few meters,
Hmm.
10, 20 meters, whatever it was that they had on that. Well, what happens if you're burning too much,
Yeah.
right? You're burning way too fast. By the time and then you kick off. Well, instead of being 10 meters above the surface, you're 100 meters or
Mm.
more above the surface, and we don't really know whether it overloaded the if it's that high, maybe the computer program landing it couldn't handle it, or maybe it just ran out of fuel trying to land. But
Okay.
anyway, it crashed onto the surface. And so, but I knew Dr. Peter Smith because he goes to the Mars Society, which I used to go to, and we sit around. There's after we, the scientists would get together and drink, and we talk about, what the aliens are doing, what the little grays are doing at the military base this week, or other things that everybody's doing. There's some interesting stories that go on behind the scenes there.
I'll bet.
But so I knew Dr. Peter Smith, so I wrote him a letter and I showed him my mathematics and I showed him, well, this is obviously wrong, the gravitational estimations. And so now he wrote me back. He said, well, I couldn't believe that JPL and NASA couldn't get gravitational amounts right, but he did change the mission parameters because the Phoenix lander, he was in charge of the Phoenix lander, was the exact same platform, a few different instruments, and it was going to land at pretty much the same latitude.
Hmm.
So he made sure what happened is when that parachute, instead of waiting, that 4 kilometer burn, and then at the end, right before it lands, turning on the radar altimeter, the minute the parachutes kicked off, the radar altimeter turned on and guided the spacecraft down to a
Okay.
successful landing. He didn't believe, so you can adjust over 4 kilometers a burn to make sure that your lander works. Where if you wait to the last, the last 10, 20 meters, you'd have problems. So that's why the Phoenix lander worked and the Mars polar lander failed.
Okay. Okay. Well, hey, you mentioned the moon. Let's jump back. Let's go back to the moon
Oh,
and the
okay.
landing there.
Yeah, that's right. As you remember, this last year, 2024, there were 4 landers that went to the
Hmm.
moon, and only one succeeded. That was the Indians' Chandrayaan 3, and they actually used my math. So we'll do that. But
Cool.
but the first thing, even before my math, there's an important thing you have to think about the moon. The moon is what's called a prolate body,
Okay.
and means it's longer between the poles. It's kind of like egg shaped,
Okay.
and the larger part of the egg is facing the Earth, right?
Oh,
See, if you were actually to fly on the moon in orbit and look at it, now this is a greatly exaggerated, okay?
sure. Sure. Yeah.
But the fat side of the egg would be facing the Earth, and then the other
Okay.
side would be there. And if you were in orbit on the side of it, you could see that the moon was an egg shape. It wouldn't be a really problem with your sensors. The
Right.
human eye, if you had a really good human eye, you might be able to see it.
Okay.
But when we look at the Earth, we just see we look at the moon, right, from the Earth, it looks perfectly spherical because we're
Okay.
seeing the egg from that perspective.
Ah,
We're not
yes.
in
Okay.
orbit, we're not seeing it like this. And so that's the nature of that's how the moon is. It's a prolate body, so it's longer between the poles than between what we call the equator. Now, when they went to the moon, what they did is they just the Earth has a North Pole and a South Pole, so they naturally put a North Pole on the moon, right, and a South
Yes.
Pole on them, just like the Earth. Well, that's not the way the moon is actually shaped. The
Okay.
moon's prolate, and the first thing you got to do is you got to realize if you're going to estimate gravitation, especially with my method of the moon, you have to actually physically map the moon in the proper way. So they put the poles in the wrong way. So the way the poles should be is you should have like the near Earth pole, which
Hmm.
is that part of the egg, kind of, and then the far Earth pole, which is the part farthest away, and actually the equator of the moon, what we see as the rim of the moon actually
Yeah.
would be the moon's equator. So
Okay.
so that way, you would have the moon if you put your latitude and longitude on it, right?
Right.
That's kind of how it would look. There's looking at the Earth. There's one of the poles. You can see your latitudes and longitudes going off there, and the far pole, and the rim is essentially the equator that we see. So when you land on a prolate body, and this is true with the Earth, the moon, or any gravity, all the moons in the solar system, they rotate. For every one rotation, there's one orbit. So they always keep the same face, usually with a mask on, facing whatever their planetary body is, right? Their planetary partner is. And so
Okay.
that's the first thing you got to do. You've got to remap the moon instead of having a north pole and a south pole, which is ridiculous. You have
Yeah.
a near body pole and a far body pole, and
Okay.
the rim that is now the equator. And if you actually look at the moon, because the way the system is, the gravitational force on the moon's equator is much higher. It is higher than it is on the near Earth poles. Remember when Armstrong landed on the
Hmm.
moon and they said he had extra fuel?
Yes.
That's because gravity was actually lower there than NASA could calculate, right? They were
Right.
using the Newtonian formulations. So he had to move out of that boulder field and he should have run out of fuel. But what happened was because gravity was actually less coming in because he hand sticked it in, he had the
Hmm.
extra fuel and he could land and there never was a problem. Well, they're landing near what they call the moon's south pole, looking for frozen water, when
Hmm.
that's actually the moon's lower equatorial quadrant, and gravity is much higher there.
Okay.
And so, well, now, okay, the first one to launch was the Indians with Shahanda 3. Actually, this all started with the iSpace
Hmm.
had I think what was the Hakito R mission or whatever, or the Hakito 2 mission. It was a Hakuto mission. And they had actually tried, it was a private Japanese company, and they actually tried to land on the moon's surface and crashed. And I was looking in on why I was just looking in, figuring out what it was, and I discovered that lo and behold, their headquarters is like about 10 miles from where I live, down
Okay.
at Centennial Airport. I'm going like, whoa, and it's a Japanese company. So I figured, it'd be in Tokyo or something. But I guess they're probably have something to do with Colorado Springs. So what I did is,
Mm.
when during that research, I suddenly discovered that the Indians were sending Chahandra 2, 3. Chahandra 2 had crashed, and I
Hmm.
didn't know they were going to send a Chahandra 3. Chahandrayan 3, right? Chahandrayan 3. Right? Got to get that pronunciation right. Sending it, and they were actually going to send it like in a month and a half, right before I discovered it.
Wow.
And
Okay.
I knew they were going to crash it because they crashed the second one, and the
Hmm.
Japanese had crashed theirs once because they couldn't calculate gravity of the moon, especially if you're going to the South Pole, which the gravity is much higher there than they possibly could estimate. And they don't have any idea how to map the moon properly, neither. So, but what's interesting, I have friends who have contacts directly with the ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization.
Hmm.
I was able to go through them, contact the Indians directly, and they got the math for this. So they knew, oh, the moon has to be mapped differently, and that gravity, when you do that, then you're going to find out gravity is much higher there. Because
Hmm.
let's say when you're landing a spacecraft, I don't know, here's my spacecraft here, right? As it comes in, you've got when you want to land, you want to have your horizontal motion and your vertical motion are virtually zero when you
Okay.
reach the surface of the planetary body. You want them exactly zero when you reach that surface of the body. Well, what happens is now you can have in your space probes, you can have radar altimeters, right? That'll tell you how far it is. So you can adjust your vertical, but you can't adjust the horizontal. So if gravity is actually higher than what you estimate, your vertical will adjust, right?
Hmm.
But you won't be able to adjust your horizontal speed. So you're going to come in landing with a horizontal speed.
Ah. Okay.
And that's going to cause your
Right.
spacecraft to tip over, which is
Okay.
exactly what happened to Odysseus. So I knew that so I gave it to the Indians, and the Indians now this comes in with the Russians because this is a moral parable story. Is the Indians when they launch their spacecraft, they have the Shahanda 3 getting the moon, and went around the Earth like 5 times, and then it
Hmm.
slowly went to the moon. Now the Ruskies have spies in the ISRO, so they had gotten a hold of the information that I had given to the Indians. They're friendly
Hmm.
spies, I guess you call them. And
Yeah.
what they did is they decided we're going to beat the Indians to the moon. So they pulled this old spacecraft. They'd been sitting on the mothballs on the shelf and of a lunar lander, and they stuck it on top of a rocket, and they fired it directly at the moon, right? Right. The
Okay.
Indians had actually already reached the moon, and they were taking like 4 or 5 times to slow down, very methodical, very precise, taking
Hmm.
their time. Well, the Russians said, "Screw that!" They just fired directly off the moon, off the Earth, directly at the moon, and they were coming in, and they'd done one orbit around the Earth. I mean, they came in and they retro rocketed in, and then they were doing their second burn around the moon, getting ready for landing, and they were going to beat the Indians to the moon, right? Because
Hmm.
the Indians took like a month and a half to get it there, right? And the Russians, they just launched straight out. But they, I think it was on the second orbital insertion, getting ready for landing. Allegedly, the thing is allegedly that a lot of the guys, it's 10 years old, right? 10, 15 years old, however old that thing was, right? They pulled off the shelf. Well, the
Hmm.
guys that worked on it, they were gone, and they brought new guys in. And there
Oh.
was a software glitch, and allegedly the the engine burned for 108 seconds versus like 47 or whatever the hell it was, and so instead of actually getting into orbit of the moon, it just hit the moon and went splat, put a big hole in it, and then the Indians completed their things and landed on the moon successfully, and so they completed successful near the moon's lower south pole or the lower equatorial constant. They're looking for water ice. They're just trying to get there, and so
Okay.
they landed. But they weren't the ones. The Japanese had also sent a probe. Now
Hmm.
I had gave the information. I wrapped it all up and sent it to the. I went down to iSpace, right, which is just 10 miles from me. And I said, hey, this is why you guys crashed. And here's the data. Here's the mathematical formula. This is how you need to map it. This is how you need to go. And then I don't know. I know they pushed it up to it went up to the main Japanese people there, whether
Hmm.
they did it or not. But the Japanese, I think it was the Slim Lander they had, and they came down, and people may know it, and they came down. And now I'm not sure whether they had a problem with one of their rocket nozzles broke. So, but anyway, they came down and they ended up upside down, right? Maybe they didn't calculate gravity right.
Oops.
Maybe it was the nozzle. Oops.
Yeah.
Well, no, so that one didn't work. So, but it still was working, by the way. I mean, it was upside down, so they could get a few missions done. Some of the things were, and they dropped a couple of little rovers off right before they landed, so little
Hmm.
bouncy ball things, and so they worked. But it was kind of not quite a full mission thing when it's upside down.
No.
And then came the Odysseus lander,
Okay.
and this was a NASA private corporation, one of those private public things. Well, they were using the NASA stuff, right? So they were
Okay.
they were doing the old NASA things, and they could not adjust. They're using probably Newtonian gravitationals to land on the south pole of the moon, because they all want to land on the south pole so they can learn about ice maybe there and all that. Well, obviously they have radar altimeters, but they couldn't take care of the horizontal motion, so Odysseus ended up on its side, which was pretty
Okay.
much the end of the mission. It came down and just crashed because it had so much horizontal motion. It just fell over on its side, and that's why one space lander got to the moon last year, and the other three failed.
Why hasn't the United States been back to the moon? I think, of course, we've been back. If we've needed to go, I say we've gone. It's just been classified missions.
Well, they probably didn't use stuff, and we actually got banned from the moon because when Apollo 17 was coming back, I mean,
Hmm.
ham radio operators could hear everything that the Apollo people were saying, right? So there was
Hmm.
there was like 10,000 of them listening, and
Hmm.
right as I believe it was when the Apollo 17 left the moon's gravitation and came into the Earth's gravitation, there was a big radio message that everybody heard, thousands and thousands of ham radio operators listening. It said, "Do not return." And we never returned.
I've heard
Well,
the
at least not with
story.
the Apollos. Yeah, and of course, NASA made 20 Apollos. I had a friend who
Right.
actually flew on one of them.
Yeah, they were
Uh,
fully budgeted all the way
oh
till
yeah, yeah,
20,
yeah.
right?
I had a friend who actually flew on one of those Apollos on a special secret space mission. I'm not
Okay.
authorized to say what it is. Maybe someday it'll come out. But
I'm
it was
guessing
an
they did
it was
not
an
launch
Earth
on a
orbital
Saturn
mission.
V.
It was an Earth orbital mission, and then that takes care of one. Maybe it was so. There's still two Apollos the Air Force used for something.
Uh-huh.
So
But
because
but
they use the 18, so that I don't know about the 1920 what they use those for, but they have them. They could have sent another mission to the moon.
and
They
it
call them
wouldn't
Apollos.
they would not have used a Saturn V because that would have been noticed, right?
No, you could have launched Saturn V from Vandenberg, and
So I think the Air Force continued with a classified parallel
well, my dad was an
Mercury and
Air
so
Force officer, and they sent him in there to help Werner von Braun. I mean, why would they do that if it was NASA was running?
exactly. Exactly.
So,
So it makes perfect sense to me what you said about, yeah, the Air Force would be the beneficiary of the
oh yeah.
Apollo stuff.
So yeah, they yeah. So I know, I knew they used one of the three leftover Apollos. So they had two others. Who knows what those missions were? Probably pretty interesting if we could ever learn those other things. They probably went to the moon again, I'll bet.
Oh,
So,
I think we can think about it. It was probably part of, maybe, it was part of the step going to Mars.
well, I've heard a legend that there was a like an old ruin on the moon,
Uh-huh.
and that one of the Apollos was used to go visit that ruin. I can't
Hmm.
confirm that.
Who
So
who banned us? Who do you think banned us?
whoever's living there right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that. I mean, that like Jose's friend who's filmed like these giant spacecraft
Yeah.
traveling between the Earth and the Moon, just picking it up on his look, it'd be like a bug hitting a windshield. If you
Yeah.
don't know, it's like, if you don't know the or kid or a infant, a toddler going out on the freeway with a tricycle.
Yeah.
If you don't know, space flight rules and what's going on there, you could easily,
Yeah.
end up as a Apollo thing would just be a bug. I mean, some of these things were like 30 to 60 kilometers across. I mean, there's a gigantic spacecraft passing between the Earth and the Moon.
Wow. Wow.
So, and there's lots of other people who filmed similar giant spacecraft out in outer space,
Yeah.
around near Earth space.
Now, and I'm one of the proponents of this idea, this hypothesis. When you watch the legendary footage of the lunar module lifting up, you've heard the theory about some type of anti-gravity technology, because the way it just pops up instead of, looking like some rocket thruster, that it was some type of anti-gravity stuff. And we know that anti-gravity technology was public and open source until the late 1950s, when suddenly it seems a lid
Yeah,
was put on it. T. Townsend Brown and all of that. What do you think about the idea that Apollo 11 had some type of anti-gravity assist?
I don't think so, because what happens is what people don't understand, like when you see the top typical rockets take off, they
Mm-hmm.
have like that area below them.
Yes.
When that Apollo came, but there was nothing below. It was attached to the lander, right?
Yes. Yeah. The
But when that
legs.
thing, you got that air, boom, of course you would. When you got all that volume of air, which you won't be able to see it because there's no atmosphere. It's not going to see any steam. And you
Right.
could see pieces of stuff just flying in different directions, pieces of metal
True.
fragments.
Yeah.
So when when the rocket shut up, there was nowhere for it to go, but poof, and that's
Yeah.
what popped it off.
And the
And the
gravity
air
difference,
pressure
right?
of all the gases being released by the rocket engines that started off just boom,
Okay.
which is
That
dangerous actually for the spacecraft because it would cause acceleration and pops and it could
mm.
cause wobbly or something. But it works and they made it back. So
I do not believe that the United States dog and pony show in front of the world, which could have ended so disastrously. Any space flight, as we know, can end disastrously. But I argue that I think we secretly tested that technology and put a crew, we landed a crew on the moon to make sure that it would work or could work before we put on the dog and pony show of Apollo 11. What do you think of
possible.
that?
Oh, and they did actually make a movie of the lander
Mm-hmm.
of us landing on the moon on the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like Nixon's backup because what they were planning is if it had crashed on the moon's surface,
Mm-hmm.
they actually had this backup movie that they would play showing them landing on the moon. And then when they took off from the moon, there was a terrible accident and they didn't return. So they actually did make a movie.
Wow.
And maybe, who was that one movie Jay Winder talks about him? I don't remember his name.
Oh, yeah.
Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah.
Stanley Kubrick may have
2001.
been the one hired to do that movie. So I know a movie because my dad saw the movie.
Okay.
It was hanging around there. They had a movie hanging out there. But it was a Nixon backup in case it
Yeah.
actually crashed on the moon surface. They could say, "Oh, look at our heroic astronauts! They landed. They did all this stuff." And
Yeah.
and then there was a tragic accident. So it would still be sort of a victory, but not
Yeah.
the same.
And some people, when I bring that up, they go, "Oh, you're taking away from their accomplishment." I'm like, "No, I'm not, because it was still an incredibly courageous thing to do, and it's still, deadly potential every time. I just don't think that in front of the world we would actually that be the first actual time we tried it and be so public about it.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
I
There's
just
it's
think we
quite yeah, it's quite
practiced.
yeah. There's probably more than the story that we haven't heard. I mean, it's like the Yuri Gagarin is the first man in space. That's not true. The Russians sent another guy into space earlier,
Mhm.
except unfortunately, the capsule came down into China, and he got captured by the communist Chinese. We're just on a good with the Soviets at the time, right? There were a little conflict there.
Yeah.
So he was actually the first guy in space. But they couldn't admit that their spacecraft came down in China. I think he broke both his legs too. It didn't come out. It came down in the wrong spot, and it came down a little faster than it should have. So they launched Yuri Gagarin, and he is the first quote official first man in space. But no, it's this other Russian guy. You can go online and read his whole story. It's the Chinese and the Soviets, or the Russians and the Chinese are released it now.
Um, an interesting little thing has been pointed out over the years, recent years, and that has to do with the movie Star Wars and how remarkably close the Death Star looks to a Saturnian moon that we
Oh yeah,
we supposedly didn't know its features at the time that movie was in pre-production and being designed and such.
yes, I've seen those photos of it. Yeah, it's got like a really big yes a big impact, and the big impact also caused that weird bulge, and
Little,
because the moons like that they're gravity locked, so the bulge is probably more mass, and so it'll all lock up because they one orbit for one rotation. So same with our moon, every moon in the solar system, and there's a lot of those planets around near stars, and they're all gravity locked. So
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
you got to make sure you map them right if you want to land
Yeah,
on
there
them.
you go, there
That's
you
why
go.
they crashed on that asteroid because they
Oh
didn't.
yeah.
You could use
Okay.
my math for asteroids. You got to do a little bit more spherical harmonic equations on top of that, but yeah, because they can't estimate gravity on asteroids, especially where the two asteroids stick together.
Yeah.
You can do my math will do it, but theirs won't. So
Well, is that true that we didn't know what that moon looked like at the time that was designed, or
no,
is that
no, they
story
sent they had
inaccurate?
those alien reproduction craft that I think they did a whole tour of the space of the entire solar system one time. Some sent some crazy guys out there, and they actually made it back alive.
When I hear Joseph McMoneagle talk about, and the others in the program, I think Lynn Buchanan has done this too. When they looked at Mars a long time ago, the whole time and
Mm.
space thing, that really intrigues me, because what do they know between remote viewing and boots on the ground about Mars and its past that they're not telling us,
Oh yeah, well, who was Ingo Swann?
Mm-hmm.
He saw the ring around Jupiter before the space probe got there and discovered that there was a
Yeah.
ring around Jupiter.
Anything we didn't cover that
Oh, there's gobs of stuff to cover. We could go on and on and on and on
we
and
got to do
on.
this again?
Yes, that's what we'll have to do.
We definitely got to do this again. So why don't you tell everybody where they can find you and what they can find
Oh
there?
yeah, I'll probably do a little thing about C60 power. When I was working on the metal oxygen fusion reactor project,
Mm-hmm.
I was using carbon 60 as a radiation protectant, and basically got rid of my macular degeneration and my electrical engineer's macular degeneration because it really sucks going blind. But it does all kinds of things. I started making it for friends, family, and myself, and then I tried it with alternative healthcare practitioners. Then one day, Cliff High mentioned it saved his and his wife's life on the Sarah Westall show, and the company kind of went there. But no, it's an amazing substance. Shopc60.com, you can go check it out, uh, and I think we talked more about it on our last show. But
Mm-hmm.
if you
Yep.
just Google my name in Ken Swartz, there's a gazillion videos out there where
Yep.
I'm talking about it. But yeah, basically, it's an incredible antioxidant. It'll make you about 10 years younger, and it's really good if you're in the gray hair crowd. It'll bring your brain back about 10 years. So it'll be, if you're in your 60s or 70s, you're going to be back in your 50s or 40s and stuff. And it's and of course it helps with health and libido and
Yep.
everything else. But yeah, if you're in the gray hair crowd, you need C60. It's that
Yeah.
good. And
It's
it's at, as you say, I think it's Ken at shop. Well, just go to shopc60.com, and then you can go there and learn about it. There's also a site called whatisc60.org,
mm-hmm.
and that's like a 5013C site that we
Mm-hmm.
and some other C60 companies, support, where you can get like all about the human, animal studies, all, the good, bad, the ugly, everything about C60 that we can't post on our own. There's
Right.
3 different agencies say you can't do this and that, but what is C60.org is a 501c3 thing, so they can do whatever they want there.
Ah, okay. And
So
folks,
yeah, it's worth it if you got a few years on you, got some gray hairs. C60, you need C60.
we've been using it, and so if you're watching this and regular viewers of the Walter Bosley channel, when you go to Ken's site shopc60.com, use WB Power C60 and you'll get your discount. That's the code. And thank you very much for offering that to the viewers here. We
Yes, and for the women, we have this. We have an under eye cream, with the
uh-huh.
copper peptides, and a facial cream. They're all,
Excellent.
of course, have C60. In fact, that was the very first study of C60 was in. They made a cream for Japanese women,
Oh,
and they put it on their face. And I know some women say Japanese women don't get lines and wrinkles, but they do. And they put it on the Japanese women, and it reduced lines and wrinkles in Japanese women. So it's real as a face. Yeah, it does. I'm a guy, so I don't do that. But women that
yeah.
use C60 like facial creams that we got the Youth Renewal Eye Cream, and then we have the anti-gravity serum. And yeah, it does amazing things for your getting rid of those wrinkles and making your face look a whole lot better.
What you need is like a real anti-gravity serum where we can.
Yes. Well, it does. It gets a little puffs out and stuff.
You're working on that. You're working on the real
Yeah,
anti-gravity. What
yeah.
can I?
One of these days, we could probably do a deep dive into C60 and stem
Let's do
cell
it.
stimulation and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Let's
So,
do it, and let's talk more about you know these other topics. Get into
yeah.
some of the
Oh, and
stuff.
because we will have more to talk about. There's a bunch of lunar missions landing on the moon again.
Oh, I
SpaceX, yeah, SpaceX launched 2 things to the moon
uh-huh.
just recently. One is the Blue Ghost lander,
Okay, that's
and
intriguing.
and that's going to land there near the South Pole. Everybody's going to the South Pole because that's where they think the most ice is. So if you're going to put a base, you got to have water. It
Now,
kind of
now,
sucks when you
now,
don't have
is
water.
that the equator South Pole or the real?
Oh, that would be the lower. That would be the quote South Pole of the moon, as they put it, right
Yeah.
down here in the south. But actually, it's the lower equatorial quadrants, and we will discern it. If they use my math, they will land successfully. If they don't, well, they crash. The Chinese already have my math. That's why their probes
There
land
you
all the
go.
time.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's
successfully, and
interesting.
then there's
The
also Firefly. That
Okay.
same iSpace people that crashed the Hakito R mission crashed. They made a new one called Firefly, and they're going to land on the moon again too. So you got, and then
Okay.
there's somebody else. Yeah, I know iSpace is sending Resilience,
Hmm.
and Blue Ghost Lander has a no Firefly is I think there is their one, and they have like a rover. I think it's called Firefly or something.
Okay.
Anyway, and then there's also something from Intuitive Machines
Hmm.
are doing the IM2 mission to the South Pole too. So we got at least 3 civilian government. I think they're going to be landing in about those 2 are going to land in about a month or 2 from now,
Hmm.
and so we're going to see if they because they got my math. At least the iSpace Resilience has my math. I don't know about the Blue Ghost Lander. That's a SpaceX
Okay.
thing. So I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe they got the math. Maybe they don't. We'll find out if they crash or not.
we're living long enough to see the real big opening of space travel,
Hmm.
and I,
Yeah, and I mean they just use the electrogravity craft. I mean, but it's like Dr. Stephen Greer. What do they use it for? Instead of exploring space, they use it for smuggling drugs and gun and human trafficking to make as much money to support their black programs as they can.
yeah.
Okay, I think that's probably not the best way to use of it, but
No, no. Well, next time we'll have to talk about the mysteries and secrets of Antarctica,
oh yes,
perhaps.
there's a lot of cool stuff going on down there for
Yeah,
sure.
great, great. Well, thanks again, Ken. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk with me and us about all these wild things that we're both interested in. And I will send you an email to get some details about how your dad customized his B-26 so I can
Oh yeah,
customize
oh
my
yeah,
model.
yeah. He went in the '60s. He was brought back in and he got a squadron together for the Portuguese.
Yeah.
Or I think Mozambique. So there's a whole story on that one. But yeah,
Okay.
he customized them all out for the Portuguese, and
Cool.
so I think they probably still somewhere in Portugal. There's probably a squadron of those guys.
It's cool.
Sitting
Cool
in a hangar.
airplane. Cool looking
Yep.
airplane. So, all righty. Well, thanks again, and we'll be talking with you soon.
Okay, great. Good to be on.
This has been another episode of the Walter Bosley Channel. Please subscribe and remember to click on the notification bell. Remember to visit walterbosley.com for my books and for the portal to more podcasts. See you next time on the Walter Bosley Channel.